Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher, and welcome to today's session on the Black Power movement and Vietnam. So we're now moving into the social movements of the 1960s. Today we're going to focus on the civil rights movement as it enters a more radical phase in the 1960s, and then we're also going to talk about how America gets increasingly involved in Vietnam during the presidency of LBJ. Next session, we'll be specifically talking about 60s social revolution. So if you're waiting for the hippies and counterculture and religion and all of those kinds of movements like feminism and Latino activism, all of that jazz, that's going to come up next session. I didn't want to scrimp on the 60s social movements portion, so that's why I've broken them down into two sessions. So as we move into talking about rights movements and social movements in the 1960s, it's important to talk about the 60s as a decade, as a whole. So, if the 1950s are all about the idea of cultural conformity because people being paranoid about being labeled communist during the Red Scare, the 60s are all about dissent. So, this is where dissent, where criticizing the government, we're criticizing the way society works, we're criticizing the norms, all become mainstream. So the 60s is really defined by protest movements, particularly driven by young people, and protesting all different kinds of reforms in society, whether we're talking about the continuing African American civil rights movement, whether we're talking about the anti-war movement, which will escalate as our involvement in Vietnam escalates, the women's rights movement, LGBTQ rights, Native American rights, Latino rights, all of these different pushes to try to make society more inclusive of all people and not just including or benefiting an elite few. This is what really marks the 1960s. And we're going to start today in talking about how the civil rights movement starts to shift as we get to the middle of the 1960s. So, in earlier sessions, we talked about the civil rights movement and how, since World War I, groups like the NAACP or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had really adopted a strategy of breaking down segregation by launching legal challenges to different areas of the system. So, breaking down segregation in housing with the 1948 Supreme Court case Shelley v. Kramer, breaking down segregation in education with the 1954 case of Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court. So, in the 40s and the 50s is when we start to see that strategy, which had been adopted decades prior, start to finally bear fruit. And as we talked about in an earlier session, this is going to be followed by public protests of civil disobedience, nonviolence, to try to highlight the injustice of other laws that maintained a system of segregation based on race. And one of the hallmarks of the movement in the 1950s and the early 1960s was this committal to nonviolence. Like we talked about, youth protesters like SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, launched protests like sit-ins to occupy segregated spaces to highlight segregation. They launched voter registration drives. They challenged segregation and things like freedom rides to show that segregation was still being illegally carried out in public transportation. But as we get to the middle of the 1960s, there's going to be some discontent with how far nonviolent protests can get you and how far the current leadership of the movement, which at this point in time is dominated by a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Council and people like Martin Luther King Jr., how much do they actually reflect the will of the average person? So there's a lot of discontent. There's a generational clash between the younger organizers of SNCC and some of these, again, older, more conservative ministers who had dominated the direction of the movement. There's also a tension between people who want to continue to focus on things like voting rights in the South versus people who want to highlight socioeconomic inequality in northern and western urban areas. So this tension starts to come to a head in the middle of the 1960s. And this is what we call the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael is actually the first person to use the phrase Black Power in 1966. And Stokely Carmichael was a member of SNCC, so he's one of these student activists, and he coined Black Power to mean potentially a variety of things. Black Power could mean agitating for giving African Americans more political power. It could be pushing for more economic opportunities and success. It could mean the potential for revolution versus a racist power structure. So it could be compatible with some of these earlier civil rights focuses, right, on breaking down discrimination and segregation and things like education and the workplace. But it could also be interpreted in a way that made it much more similar to anti-colonial movements happening in places like Africa and Asia during the same time period. And in fact, if you are a fan of blaxploitation pics, there's a movie from the early 1970s called The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which is based on a novel of the same name published in the late 60s. And the premise of the novel is, in the name of proving racial enlightenment, the CIA recruits their first Black spy. And this one guy makes it through the training, but they were expecting everybody to wash out. So when this guy unexpectedly makes it through the training, they just give him a menial job. Basically, he becomes a copy boy, but he still goes through all this CIA training, including on counterinsurgency tactics. And so then he decides he's going to leave the CIA. He tells them he's going to go back and work with impoverished youth in his native Chicago. They all laud him, saying, "Oh, that's so great. You want to help out your race." And then he actually works to teach these teenagers in urban Chicago how to be revolutionaries. And the whole premise of the film is that they're training to launch an insurgency against the United States government because of this legacy of systemic racism. So this was a film that was designed very much, and in fact, if you look up the trailer on YouTube, designed very much to scare the bejesus out of white people. But it does also, both the film and the book, make a lot of interesting parallels between what's being experienced by minorities in the United States and what's being experienced by these people working to gain independence in these colonies. Malcolm X definitely draws a lot of parallels between the experience of African Americans and people internationally in places like Africa and Asia. Malcolm X is oftentimes held up as the complete opposite of Martin Luther King Jr., the Magneto to Martin Luther King Jr.'s Professor X, if you want to be nerdy. That's not quite accurate, but they did have some key differences. So Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little, and he had a very rough early life. As a young man, he got involved in some crime. He ended up going to prison. And while he was in prison, he converted to a religious group called the Nation of Islam. It's important to understand that the Nation of Islam is not mainstream Islam. So this was a group that took a lot of ideas from Islam, but also had a lot of ideas very reminiscent of Marcus Garvey. So this notion of self-sufficiency, of wanting to separate because there was no way white mainstream society was going to accept them as equal. So to create kind of separate spaces where they could ensure their own equality. So the Nation of Islam is this very interesting mix of world religion and anti-colonial politics. So Malcolm X becomes kind of the foil to Martin Luther King Jr. because he is much more candid when he speaks. Martin Luther King Jr. in many ways had to develop the way of speaking style, in part because not only a class difference, the very different background than Malcolm X, but also the notion that Martin Luther King Jr. was also operating a lot of spaces where he had to deal with white middle class people, whereas Malcolm X is speaking more towards fellow African Americans. In particular, Malcolm X becomes a little bit of a controversial figure because he calls out the idea of nonviolence. He goes, well, nonviolence is all well and good, but I believe that if somebody's trying to hurt you, you have the right to self-defense. So he was really challenging how useful nonviolence was as a tool if it was, in effect, getting some activists killed. And because of that, because he said that, then the interpretation was in mainstream media, oh, he wants to be able to, arm everybody and start killing white people. After Malcolm X visited Mecca in 1964 as an attempt to understand mainstream Islam, he does start to drift away from the Nation of Islam interpretation more towards a traditional Islam, and he starts to soften his rhetoric and kind of promote a little bit more unity, especially after seeing the very great diversity of Muslim people worldwide on his pilgrimage to Mecca. And he is assassinated while speaking in 1965. Most people attribute his assassination to the Nation of Islam, arguing that there was a significant rift between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and that he had grown a little bit too prominent and powerful for their liking. Other people float theories that his assassination was the result of other groups, but Malcolm X nevertheless becomes a martyr for the civil rights movement at that time. Now, Malcolm X's emphasis on nonviolence only working to a certain point, and that people should have the right to self-defense, comes to be explored more with the founding of the Black Panther Party, a group in Oakland that is founded in 1966. For the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X's message of self-defense made a lot of compelling sense. In particular, African Americans living in Oakland experienced a lot of police brutality. And so for them, the idea of self-defense was very appealing. And unfortunately, this focusing on exercising rights, including Second Amendment rights to own weapons, exercising this notion of self-defense, that they're not just going to passively be attacked, meant that the FBI and local police oftentimes targeted Panther leaders for violence, and many Black Panther leaders were actually killed in shootouts. However, the Black Panther Party is not just focused on self-defense, but also community improvement. So the Black Panther Party also runs health clinics, schools, after-school programs for children to try to focus on building up and bettering their community. This is part of the Black Power movement, this idea of empowerment, right? Empowering the community to improve and grow, taking pride in your Black cultural heritage. And we see this as well in mainstream Black culture in the 1960s. The Black is Beautiful movement to challenge this notion that African Americans had to maintain kind of Western beauty standards to be considered beautiful, the embrace of natural hair texture and the hairstyle of the Afro, a switch from calling African Americans Negro, which was the older label used, to instead Afro or African American, comes during this time. Think about it. You've probably heard songs like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown. This is all coming out of this era, right? To take pride in African American identity and the uniqueness in their heritage, and also to focus on bettering their communities. And in particular, urban areas in the United States were still suffering despite Lyndon Baines Johnson's war on poverty. Lots of issues were fairly unique to these urban areas. There was a relative lack of jobs, so even if you had job skills training programs under the war on poverty, if there's no jobs for you to use those skills in, that doesn't help you. There's also very poor quality housing in a lot of urban areas because of a lack of investment in maintenance and infrastructure. And in many northern and western cities throughout the 1960s, there were a series of riots for somewhat different but very similar reasons. Harlem experiences the first of these 1960s riots in 1964. This riot is sparked by accusations of police brutality against a young African American man. Watts in Los Angeles in 1965 happens after a traffic stop by a white cop of African Americans. And the Watts riots is among the most damaging. 50,000 people riot, 35 people are killed, and it takes 15,000 police and National Guardsmen to restore order. In the end, the Watts riots resulted in $30 million of damage. In 1967, the cities of Detroit and Newark both experienced riots. In Detroit, a police raid on a bar called a Blind Pig, or an illegal underground bar, in which veterans are celebrating homecoming from Vietnam, ends up sparking a wave of riots across the city, leaving 43 dead and hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. With all of these riots spreading out across these cities, and again, note that these are not southern cities, these are cities in the North and the West, Congress felt the need to examine this wave of riots. And in 1968, the Kerner Commission, named after Otto Kerner, who was the lead investigator in this congressional committee, publishes the Kerner Report. And the Kerner Report said that all of these riots in these different places happened because of poverty and systemic racism, that conditions in inner city areas that rioted were not going to improve unless the nation moved to address these chronic problems. As the Kerner Report famously stated, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And if what's depressing is if you look at the Kerner Commission report, which comes out, by the way, right around the time that we see another wave of riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. If you look at the Kerner report and you look at reports from riots happening during World War II in 1943, riots that happened after World War I in 1919, riots, the report after the Rodney King riots in 1992 in Los Angeles, and you strip them out of the dates and the specifics, their recommendations is much the same. They all diagnose issues of chronic poverty and systemic racism, and they all recommend the same things: focus on improving equality. And unfortunately, that's very difficult to do, and that takes a lot of long-term investment and long-term political will. Nevertheless, this is going to be the time period where we see a shift in the civil rights movement, away from things like focusing on voter rights and more towards socioeconomic goals. So in other words, even people like Martin Luther King Jr. begin to argue for federal action in developing urban areas, job programs, focusing on poverty. So there's this shift away from focusing on legal and political rights to instead socioeconomic equality. And that as well, which again is not an easy, quick fix, helps to radicalize the movement, because what does that mean? How do you ensure equality of condition in these spaces? Similarly, in colleges across the United States, we see radicalization of white college students. In particular, we have the formation of what we call the New Left, which is kind of a weird name because the New Left isn't really all that new. In many ways, you can see the influences of many older movements like the Democratic Republican Party in the 1790s, abolitionists in the 1800s, bohemians in the early 1900s, all kind of influencing this movement within more leftist politics. And for people who identified as part of the New Left, which included Black Power activists and these white college students, they don't talk about economic or social citizenship. Instead, they talk about how average Americans are increasingly powerless and isolated in the face of a government that is dominated by bureaucracy and by an elite few. They saw that the government was an active agent in perpetuating inequality. They believed that as long as society remained deeply consumerist, and again, the average American citizen didn't have any agency or political power, that this would not fix the problems of inequality. Now, despite this, they don't identify as communists. They're still very much anti-communist, but they do agitate for a more authentic and responsive government with mass participation of all Americans and little exclusion of any group. So when it comes to college students, groups like the Students for Democratic Society, or SDS, founded in 1962, start to mobilize this as a political movement. In their founding statement, the Port Huron Statement, the Students for a Democratic Society criticized the status quo, arguing for a truly participatory democracy. The SDS grew rapidly in college campuses across the United States, growing to about 8,000 members by the end of 1962. And in fact, universities will play a big role in motivating students to be involved in civil rights and protests. More than 7 million students were in college by 1968, a number that was historically unprecedented, again, driven by a relatively prosperous economy. And a lot of these students kind of gain their first exposure to different ideas and to protest movements at these college campuses. One of the earliest expression of mass student movements takes place at UC Berkeley in 1964, when Berkeley begins to restrict free speech on school grounds. This prompts a response from students of different political affiliations for having their speech squelched. And this will eventually evolve not into just a conversation on freedom of speech on college campuses, but also a critique of the modern university system, which they argued had strayed from its original mission to educate young people on critical thinking and to be productive citizens, and instead was now a much more impersonal factory-like apparatus, churning out these graduates, but basically just for jobs. Berkeley, after a series of protests by students, repealed the free speech ban in 1965, and a lot of these students, impressed with the power that they had been able to exert and win from UC Berkeley, become involved in other activist movements as well.